In the forests of northern Lordaeron, where silver birch trees grow so tall their canopies seem to hold up the sky, there once lived a people whose eyes burned like embers. The High Elves of Quel'Thalas had built their civilization upon the energies of the Sunwell, a font of arcane magic so ancient and so powerful that it suffused every leaf, every stone, every living heart in their verdant homeland. The light of the Sunwell was warm and eternal, or so they believed. It was a light that would endure forever, much like the elves themselves, graceful, proud, and seemingly unchanging across the long millennia of the world. Among those elves, in that golden age before darkness came, there was one whose name was spoken with a particular kind of reverence, not the reverence reserved for kings or sorcerers, but the quieter respect accorded to those who guard the borders, who watch the edges of the map, who stand between the known world and the vast dark beyond. Her name was Sylvanas Windrunner, and she was the Ranger General of Silvermoon, the highest military authority of the Elven Kingdom, commander of the Farstriders, and perhaps the finest archer and tactician her people had ever produced. To understand who Sylvanas would become, one must first understand who she was. And to understand who she was, one must listen to the birdsong in those ancient forests, and imagine a young elf running through the dappled light, her silver hair catching the glow of enchanted trees. The Windrunner family was one of the most distinguished lineages in Quel'Thalas. Sylvanas was the middle child of 3 sisters, Alaria, the eldest, fierce and restless, who would one day leave the forests entirely to fight demons on distant worlds, Varisa, the youngest, who would find her place among human allies in the city of Dalaran. Sylvanas was the one who stayed. She was the anchor, the keeper of the hearth, the one who felt the weight of duty most keenly. Where Alaria burned with wanderlust, Sylvanas burned with devotion to her homeland. She rose through the ranks of the Farstriders, the elite ranger corps tasked with patrolling the vast wilderness of Quel'Thalas and its borders. The Farstriders were not mere soldiers. They were hunters, trackers, diplomats with the land itself. They knew every trail through the Eversong woods, every stream in the Ghostlands, every whisper of wind that might carry the scent of an invader. Sylvanas excelled in this role with a natural grace that seemed almost effortless. She could read the movement of armies in the rustling of leaves. She could anticipate an ambush by the silence of birds. By the time she was appointed Ranger General, she was the youngest elf ever to hold the position. Some among the older houses murmured that it was too soon, that her family name had carried her further than her experience warranted. Those murmurs did not last. Under Sylvanas's leadership, the Farstriders became sharper, more disciplined, more vigilant than they had been in centuries. She led from the front, sharing the hardships of her rangers, sleeping in the same rain-soaked camps, eating the same cold rations. She earned their loyalty not through speeches, but through presence. And yet there was a melancholy to her, even in those bright days. Those who served closely with her sometimes caught a distant look in her golden eyes, the look of someone who senses, on some deep and inarticulate level, that the peace they are guarding is fragile, that all the beauty around them is held in place by forces that could, at any moment, shift. She never spoke of this feeling. She simply worked harder, trained longer, watched the borders more carefully. The borders she watched were not those facing the human kingdoms to the south, though relations with Lordaeron had occasionally been strained. The true threat, the one that occupied Sylvanas's strategic imagination, came from the north. Beyond the forests of Quel'Thalas lay the frozen wastes of Northrend, a continent of ice and death where, it was whispered, an ancient evil stirred. The High Elves had long dismissed these whispers. They had their magical wards, their runestones, their enchanted borders. No army had breached them in thousands of years. Why should the future be any different from the past? Sylvanas was not so certain. She had studied the old histories, the accounts of the Troll Wars, the records of the Amani incursions. She knew that borders were not walls, they were lines of vigilance, and vigilance could fail. She strengthened the patrols. She improved the communication networks between ranger outposts. She drilled her rangers in scenarios that others considered unlikely. A massive force moving south from the frozen north. A necromantic assault on the very stones of the kingdom. When the warning signs finally came, they came slowly at first. Reports from outlying villages of strange sickness spreading among the wildlife. Deer found dead in the forests with their eyes frozen open. Streams that ran cold even in summer. Sylvanas sent scouting parties deeper into the northern wilderness than any had ventured in living memory. Some returned with tales of shambling figures in the snow, of an unnatural cold that seemed to move with purpose. Others did not return at all. The Scourge came like a winter that had learned to hate. It was not merely an army, it was a tide, a wave of undeath that consumed everything in its path and added its victims to its own ranks. At its head rode a figure that had once been a paladin of the light, a prince of Lordaeron named Arthas Menethil, who had taken up a cursed rune blade called Frostmourne and surrendered his soul to the Lich King, the dark intelligence that directed the Scourge from its frozen throne in Northrend. Arthas entered Quel'Thalas with a single, terrible purpose, to reach the Sunwell and use its power to raise a creature of immense dark magic, a necromancer named Kel'Thuzad as a lich. To accomplish this, he was willing to destroy an entire civilization. Sylvanas met him at the border. She had gathered every ranger she could muster, positioned them along the approaches to Silvermoon, and prepared a defense in depth that exploited every advantage the forest could offer. The rangers fought brilliantly. They used the terrain, the trees, the magical wards to slow the Scourge advance to a crawl. For a time, it seemed as though the elven defenders might hold. But Arthas was relentless, and he was no longer truly human. He did not tire. He did not grieve the losses in his own ranks, for his soldiers were already dead. He simply kept coming, smashing through defensive lines with brute force and necromantic power, raising the fallen rangers as undead servants who turned their bows against their former comrades. Each day, the Scourge grew larger, while the defenders grew fewer. Sylvanas fought with a ferocity that surprised even those who knew her well. She was everywhere along the line, rallying shattered units, organising retreats that turned into counterattacks, placing arrow after arrow into the rotting flesh of the undead, with a precision that spoke of decades of training. But she could see, with the cold clarity of a tactician, that the math was against her. For every undead she destroyed, the Scourge claimed 2 more from the living. The war of attrition was unwinnable. When the outer defences finally collapsed, Sylvanas fell back towards Silvermoon itself. She organised a last stand at a choke point in the forest, a narrow passage flanked by ancient runestones, where the elven defenders could make the Scourge pay for every inch. The battle was savage. Sylvanas personally engaged the undead forces with sword and bow, fighting until her quiver was empty and her blade was notched. She bought her people precious hours, but Arthas did not simply bypass her. He sought her out. Perhaps he recognised her as the heart of the resistance, the one whose tactical genius was making his advance so costly. Or perhaps there was something else, some dark satisfaction in destroying the best and brightest of a people he intended to annihilate. He found her on the field of battle, surrounded by the bodies of her fallen rangers, still fighting. Their confrontation was brief and brutal. Sylvanas was skilled among the finest warriors of her age, but Arthas was something more than mortal now. Frostmourne was not merely a weapon, it was a conduit for the Lich King's power, and it struck with a cold that went beyond physical sensation. When the cursed blade pierced Sylvanas, she felt not just pain but a severance, a tearing at the very fabric of her being. Her soul was ripped from her body with a violence that defied description. She died, and then she was not permitted to remain dead. What Arthas did to Sylvanas Windrunner was, in its way, more cruel than simple murder. He raised her not as a mindless ghoul or a shambling skeleton, but as a banshee, a spirit of rage and anguish bound to his will. She retained her consciousness, her memories, her identity. She could think, feel, remember. She simply could not act of her own volition. She was a prisoner in her own unlife, forced to watch through spectral eyes as Arthas completed his destruction of Quel'Thalas, as the Sunwell was corrupted, as her homeland was reduced to ash and death. The experience of being a banshee is difficult to convey in mortal terms. Imagine being fully awake, fully aware, while your body, or what remains of it, is used as an instrument of someone else's will. Imagine screaming without sound, fighting without movement, raging without release. Imagine watching everything you loved burn and being compelled to fan the flames. This was Sylvanas' existence for what felt like an eternity. She was made to serve alongside other risen dead, other spirits of fallen elves who had been twisted into the Scourge's service. But Sylvanas was different from the others. Where most banshees descended into madness, their identities dissolving into an endless wail of torment, Sylvanas held on to herself with a tenacity that was almost frightening. She remembered who she was. She remembered her name. She remembered the colour of the sky over Silvermoon before the fires. She kept these memories like stones in her pockets, weighing her down, but also keeping her anchored to something real. Arthas carried her with him as he moved south, through the ruins of Lordaeron, through the fall of the human kingdoms, through the establishment of the Scourge's dominion over the northern eastern kingdoms. Sylvanas was his trophy, his instrument, a symbol of the completeness of his victory. The Ranger General of Silvermoon, reduced to a wailing shade in his service. He did not consider that she might one day break free. Why would he? The Lich King's power was absolute. No servant had ever defied it, but the Lich King's power was not, as it turned out, eternal. Deep in Northrend, the frozen throne that held the Lich King's spirit began to crack. Whether through the machinations of Illidan Stormrage, who had assaulted it with arcane magic, or through some flaw inherent in its construction, the throne's power diminished, and with it the iron grip that Arthas held over his servants. Sylvanas felt it before she understood it. It began as a whisper, a faint stirring of something she had not experienced since the moment of her death. Agency, choice. The whisper grew into a voice, and the voice grew into a roar, and suddenly, with a sensation like breaking through the surface of dark water, she was free. She was not alone in her liberation. Many of the undead who had served the Scourge found themselves released from the Lich King's control at the same moment. They were confused, terrified, trapped in decaying bodies, shunned by the living, and haunted by the atrocities they had committed while under the Lich King's sway. They were, in every meaningful sense, refugees, displaced persons in a world that did not want them. Sylvanas gathered them. It was what she had always done, organised the scattered, defended the vulnerable, built order from chaos. She led the freed undead to the ruins of Lordaeron's capital city, the great underground fortress, known as the Undercity, and there she established a new nation. She called them the Forsaken, a name that carried a double meaning. They had been forsaken by the Lich King who made them, and they had been forsaken by the living world that recoiled from their existence. The Forsaken were a strange and unsettling people. They were undead, yes, but they were not mindless. They retained their personalities, their skills, their memories of lives now lost. Many had been humans of Lordaeron, farmers, merchants, scholars, soldiers, who had been killed and raised by the Scourge. Now they existed in a state that defied easy categorization. They did not eat or sleep in the biological sense. They did not age. They felt no warmth, tasted no food, knew no physical pleasure. But they thought, they remembered, they hoped, and they feared. What they feared most was extinction. The living hated them. The Alliance, to which many of them had belonged in life, refused to accept them as anything other than monsters. The Scourge, from which they had broken free, still roamed the world, a constant reminder of what they had been and what they might become again. The Forsaken needed allies, and allies were scarce. It was this desperation that drove Sylvanas to the Horde. The Orcish Horde, once the mortal enemy of Lordaeron, had undergone its own transformation in recent years. Under the leadership of Thrall, the Orcs had sought to redeem themselves, to build a new civilization founded on honour rather than conquest. They were outcasts themselves, distrusted by the Alliance, and they were willing to accept allies that others would not. The alliance between the Forsaken and the Horde was pragmatic rather than warm. Sylvanas did not trust the Orcs, and they did not entirely trust her. But survival trumped sentiment. The Forsaken brought their alchemical knowledge, their intelligence networks, and their strategic position in the heart of Lordaeron. The Horde brought military support and a degree of legitimacy. Together, they formed a partnership that would shape the political landscape of Azeroth for years to come. Sylvanas governed the Undercity with a firm hand and a watchful eye. She was not loved. The Forsaken were too damaged for love, and Sylvanas was too guarded. But she was respected, even feared. She had an intelligence that cut through pretense, a strategic mind that could see 3 moves ahead, and a ruthlessness that she deployed without hesitation when her people were threatened. She also harboured a secret that few knew and none fully understood. She was in pain. The process of becoming a Banshee, of being torn from her body and then returned to it in an undead form, had left wounds that never healed. She felt the absence of her former life like a phantom limb, the warmth of sunlight, the taste of food, the sound of wind through living trees. She had been a creature of the forest, attuned to the rhythms of the natural world, and now she existed outside those rhythms entirely. The world moved around her, and she did not move with it. This pain fueled a determination that bordered on obsession. Sylvanas became fixated on the question of what happened to souls after death. As a Banshee, she had experienced the transition, the tearing away of life, the cold void, and she had not found peace on the other side. She had found only servitude. This troubled her deeply. If the Forsaken were to die again, truly die, permanently, what awaited them? Was there a resting place for souls that had already been violated once, or was there only oblivion? These questions would prove prophetic, but not for many years. In the immediate present, there were more pressing concerns. The Wrathgate incident demonstrated how fragile the Forsaken's position truly was. A faction within the Forsaken, operating without Sylvanas' authorization, deployed a devastating plague at the Battle of the Wrathgate, a weapon that killed indiscriminately, destroying both Alliance and Horde soldiers alongside the Scourge forces they had been fighting. The plague was a product of Forsaken alchemy, and its use caused an international crisis that nearly destroyed the alliance between the Forsaken and the Horde. Sylvanas had not ordered the attack. The responsible parties, a group called the Royal Apothecary Society, led by agents who harboured their own secret agenda, had acted independently. But the blame fell on Sylvanas regardless. She was the Banshee Queen, the leader of the Forsaken, and the sins of her people were her sins. The Horde's leadership questioned her control over her own faction. The Alliance demanded retribution. The Undercity itself was nearly lost in the chaos that followed. Sylvanas survived this crisis through a combination of political skill and sheer force of will. She purged the conspirators, reasserted her authority, and demonstrated to the Horde's leadership that she remained the indispensable leader of the Forsaken. But the incident left scars. It reminded her, and the world, that the Forsaken existed on a knife's edge, tolerated but never fully accepted, always one misstep away from annihilation. The years that followed brought new conflicts, new alliances, and new betrayals. The world of Azeroth was not a place that rewarded peace. There was always another enemy, another crisis, another war. Sylvanas led the Forsaken through these trials with the same grim determination she had shown as Ranger General, adapting her strategies to each new threat, protecting her people with every tool at her disposal. But something was changing in Sylvanas. The questions she had harboured about death and the afterlife were not merely philosophical. She had begun to learn things, through intelligence reports, through encounters with beings from beyond the veil, through her own experiences at the boundary between life and death, that suggested the cosmic order was not what it appeared to be. The Shadowlands, the realm of death that awaited all mortal souls, was not a place of balance or justice. It was a place of hierarchy and power, where souls were sorted and used, and, in some cases, tormented. The worst of it was the Maw. Sylvanas discovered that there existed a region of the Shadowlands, a prison really, a place of eternal suffering, where souls could be sent to be tormented indefinitely. It was not a place of punishment for the wicked. It was a place where any soul could end up, depending on the judgment of powers that did not answer to mortal morality. And behind the Maw stood an intelligence of terrifying scope and ambition, a being called Zoval, the jailer, who had been imprisoned there eons ago, and who had been working with infinite patience to unmake the very fabric of reality. What Sylvanas learned about the jailer and the Maw shattered something fundamental in her understanding of the world. She had spent years believing that her suffering, the suffering of the Forsaken, the suffering of all the world's victims, was at least contained, that death offered some kind of resolution, some final accounting. Instead, she discovered that the system was broken, that the afterlife was not a place of rest, but a place of exploitation, that the souls of the innocent could be ground up and used to fuel the ambitions of cosmic tyrants. This knowledge transformed Sylvanas. It hardened her. It made her willing to consider actions that she would once have found unconscionable. She made a bargain with the jailer, a deal that she believed would ultimately serve the greater good, even as it required her to commit acts of terrible darkness. She became the architect of a conflict that consumed Azeroth, a war between the Alliance and the Horde that was engineered not for political gain, but to generate the souls the jailer needed to break free of his prison and remake reality. The Burning of Teldrassil was the most infamous act of this campaign. The great tree, home to the Night Elves and a symbol of life and hope, was set ablaze under Sylvanas' order. Thousands died. Civilians, children, people who had no part in any war. The act was monstrous, and Sylvanas knew it. She committed it anyway, because she had calculated that the short-term suffering would be outweighed by the long-term salvation of every soul trapped in the Maw. It was a calculation that few could accept. Even among the Forsaken, even among the Horde, there were those who looked at what Sylvanas had become and could not reconcile it with the leader they had followed. The Ranger General of Silvermoon, the defender of her people, had become something that burned worlds. But Sylvanas' story was not yet finished. When the jailer's plan reached its culmination, when his true intentions became clear, not to reform the cosmic order, but to dominate it absolutely, to become the sole arbiter of all reality, Sylvanas saw the truth of her bargain. She had traded one form of servitude for another. She had believed she was working toward liberation, but she had been an instrument all along, a tool used by a power that understood her pain and her determination and had shaped them to its own purposes. The moment of realization was devastating. In the depths of the Maw, facing the jailer as he prepared to enact his final plan, Sylvanas understood that she had been deceived. The entity she had trusted to remake the broken system intended only to break it further. The souls she had sought to save would be no better off under the jailer than they had been under the old order. Her suffering, her compromises, her monstrous acts, all of it had been for nothing. In that moment, Sylvanas did something that surprised everyone, perhaps most of all herself. She turned. She defied the jailer. She stood against the power she had served, knowing that she had no hope of defeating it alone, knowing that her defiance might mean her own annihilation, knowing that even if she survived, she would be held accountable for everything she had done. The battle that followed was fought on a cosmic scale, but its pivotal moment was deeply personal. An arrow, loosed by Sylvanas' own hand, struck a blow against the jailer's plan at a critical juncture. It was a small thing in the context of the forces arrayed, but it was enough. The jailer was defeated, the Maw's power was contained. The cosmic order, while still imperfect, was preserved from the greater catastrophe that had threatened it. Sylvanas survived. She stood in the aftermath of the jailer's defeat, surrounded by the heroes who had fought alongside her, some of whom she had wronged grievously, and she did not run. She did not make excuses. She did not claim that her actions had been justified by the outcome. She accepted responsibility. She submitted to judgment. The judgment, when it came, was not simple. There were those who called for her death, who argued that the burning of Teldrassil, the manipulation of the Horde, the alliance with the jailer, were crimes that could not be redeemed. There were others who argued that she had been manipulated, that the jailer had exploited her genuine grief and her legitimate concerns about the broken afterlife, and that she deserved some measure of mercy. The sentence that was ultimately imposed was neither death nor absolution. Sylvanas was sent into the Maw itself, the very realm of torment she had sought to dismantle, to shepherd the souls trapped there toward the peace they had been denied. It was a penance that would last as long as it took, perhaps forever. There is a certain poetry to this ending, though it is a dark poetry. The Ranger General, who once patrolled the borders of a forest, now patrols the borders of the realm of death itself, guiding the lost toward a rest she may never share. She does this work alone, in silence, in the dark. She does not complain. She does not seek forgiveness. She simply continues to do what she has always done: guard the borders, watch for threats, protect the vulnerable. Whether Sylvanas Windrunner was a hero or a villain is a question that has no clean answer. She was a protector who became a destroyer. She was a victim who became a perpetrator. She loved her people with a ferocity that ultimately consumed her compassion for others. She sought to fix a broken world and broke it further in the attempt. She was, in the end, neither the Ranger General nor the Banshee Queen, but something more complicated and more human than either title suggests. A soul in pain, making impossible choices in an imperfect world and living with the consequences. The forests of Quel'Thalas still stand, though they bear the scars of the Scourge's passage. The Sunwell has been restored, though its light is different now, touched by both arcane and holy energies, a blend of what it was and what it has become. The Fast Riders still patrol the borders, though their Ranger General has been gone for many years, and somewhere in the darkness of the Maw, a figure with silver hair and golden eyes moves among the tormented, whispering words of guidance, pointing the way toward a peace that she earned for others but denied to herself. Perhaps that is the truest thing that can be said about Sylvanas Windrunner. She was a guardian, not a perfect one, not a kind one, not always a wise one, but a guardian nonetheless, from her first days running through the Eversong woods to her last days walking the endless dark. She guarded what she loved, even when what she loved changed shape, even when the guarding cost her everything, even when the borders she watched were the borders between life and death itself. The wind still blows through the forests of Quel'Thalas. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear it, not a voice exactly, but a presence, a watchfulness, the echo of a ranger who once stood in the dappled light